Step out of the car, now. The command cut through the quiet night like it had been waiting for someone exactly like her, and as the red and blue lights reflected off the smooth black paint of Naomi Carter's sedan, the entire street seemed to shrink into that single moment, that single decision, that single assumption. Imagine standing there, heart steady but eyes watched, knowing you've done nothing wrong and still being treated like you don't belong. Naomi didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She opened the door slowly, the soft click echoing louder than it should have, and stepped out into the cold air, her heels touching the pavement with quiet precision as if every movement was measured, controlled, intentional. Officer Daniel Brooks watched her like he had already made up his mind, like her presence alone was enough evidence. "License and registration," he said again, sharper this time, his tone carrying more than authority, it carried judgment. Naomi reached into her bag without hesitation, her fingers steady, her expression unreadable, but something in her eyes didn't match the situation. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was something else, something patient. Around them, a few distant headlights slowed, curious drivers glancing over, sensing tension without knowing why. Brooks stepped closer, scanning her car, circling like he expected to find something hidden, something that would justify the stop he couldn't explain. "Where are you coming from?" he asked, his voice low, pressing, waiting for a slip that never came. Naomi handed over her ID, her gaze meeting his for just a second longer than most people would dare, and in that second, something shifted, something subtle, something he didn't understand. Because while he saw a woman standing alone on a quiet American street, Naomi Carter knew exactly where she was, exactly what she was doing, and exactly how this moment would unfold. Her phone, still in her hand, vibrated once, barely noticeable, easy to miss, but she felt it. And she didn't look down. She didn't need to. Brooks glanced at the ID, his brow tightening, suspicion growing instead of fading, as if the truth in front of him only made him dig deeper into something that wasn't there. "You mind if I take a look inside your vehicle?" he asked, already moving before she answered, already assuming the right to push further. Naomi exhaled slowly, the night air cool against her skin, her silence louder than any protest. Somewhere in the distance, a low rumble began to build, faint at first, almost like thunder rolling in from miles away, but this wasn't weather. And as Brooks leaned closer, unaware, unbothered, convinced he was still in control, the world around them was already shifting in ways he couldn't see yet. Because this wasn't just a traffic stop. And she wasn't just a woman he could question. But he hadn't realized that, not yet. Brooks did not wait for permission, his hand already brushing along the edge of the car door as he peered inside, his flashlight cutting sharp lines through the dark interior as if he expected something to jump out and prove him right, and that was the moment everything slowed, not in motion but in meaning, because Naomi did not move, she did not protest, she simply stood there with a stillness that felt out of place. Like she was not reacting to him but observing something beyond him. Something he could not yet see, and that silence began to stretch, heavy and deliberate, pressing against the space between them. "You are awfully calm for someone being stopped like this," Brooks muttered, half to himself, half to her, but there was a crack in his tone now, something uncertain creeping in where confidence had been just seconds ago. Naomi tilted her head slightly, her eyes following his movements with quiet precision, as if every step he took was being recorded somewhere far beyond this street, far beyond this moment. "I have nothing to hide, officer," she said, her voice even, controlled, but not submissive, never that, and something about the way she said it made the words land differently, not defensive but final, like a statement that did not need to be proven. Brooks exhaled through his nose, glancing down at the identification in his hand again, his thumb pressing against the surface as if the answer might reveal itself if he looked long enough, but instead of clarity, there was only discomfort, a growing sense that the situation was not unfolding the way it usually did, not following the script he had played out 100 times before. The faint rumble from the distance grew louder now, no longer mistaken for background noise, no longer ignorable, and Brooks paused for just a fraction of a second, his head turning slightly as if his instincts were trying to catch up with something his mind had not processed yet. Naomi noticed it. Of course she did. But she did not turn, she did not acknowledge the sound, she simply watched him, waiting, as if the moment itself was about to reveal something he was not ready to face. "Stay right there," Brooks said quickly, his voice tightening as he stepped back from the vehicle, his posture shifting from control to caution. And that shift, small as it was, changed everything. The street, once empty and quiet, now felt like it was holding its breath, the air thick with something unspoken, something inevitable. The rumble became engines, low and controlled, approaching with purpose, and the glow of headlights appeared at the far end of the road, not one, not two, but several, moving in formation, steady and direct. Brooks narrowed his eyes, trying to make sense of it, trying to hold on to the authority he had claimed just minutes ago, but it was slipping, slowly, quietly, like sand through his fingers. Naomi finally moved, just slightly, lifting her chin as the lights drew closer, her expression unchanged, her composure intact, and in that moment, it became clear that she had not been waiting for permission, she had been waiting for timing, and whatever was coming down that road, it was not for him to control. The headlights did not slow as they approached, their beams steady and aligned like they had a destination already locked in, and for the first time since the stop began, Officer Brooks took a step back without meaning to, his posture tightening as the low hum of engines filled the air around him, no longer distant, no longer uncertain, but present, controlled, deliberate. 3 black vehicles rolled to a precise stop just yards away, their engines idling with a quiet authority that felt heavier than sirens, heavier than commands, and the moment their doors opened, the atmosphere shifted completely. Uniformed personnel stepped out in silence, their movements coordinated, their presence unmistakable, not rushed, not aggressive, just exact, like every second had been calculated long before Brooks ever turned on his lights. He glanced at Naomi, expecting confusion, expecting reaction, but found none. She stood exactly where she had been, shoulders relaxed, gaze forward, as if this was not an interruption but a continuation. One of the approaching figures moved with purpose, his eyes fixed ahead, not on Brooks, not on the scene, but on her. "Ma'am," he said firmly as he reached her, his voice carrying a level of respect that cut through the tension like a clean line, and in that single word, everything Brooks thought he understood began to fracture. He looked between them, his grip on the situation slipping as the pieces refused to fit together. "What is this?" Brooks asked, his voice sharper than he intended, trying to reclaim ground that was already gone. But no one answered him, not immediately, and that silence was louder than anything that had come before. The man standing in front of Naomi straightened slightly, his posture formal, his tone measured. "We have been trying to reach you," he continued, as if the delay mattered more than the situation itself, as if time, not authority, was the real concern. Naomi finally shifted, just enough to acknowledge him, her hand lowering from where her phone rested, her expression calm but focused, like someone stepping back into a role that had never actually paused. "I received the signal," she replied, her voice quiet but certain, and Brooks felt something tighten in his chest, something unfamiliar, something he could not explain. He looked down at the identification still in his hand, then back at her, then at the men now standing between them, and for the first time, doubt was no longer a passing thought, it was a reality he could not ignore. "Officer," one of them said finally, turning toward Brooks with a calm that carried more weight than any raised voice. "We will take it from here." There was no hostility in the words, no confrontation, just a statement that left no room for argument. Brooks opened his mouth, ready to question, ready to push back, but the words did not come the way they usually did. Because the balance had already shifted, not with force, not with resistance, but with presence, with truth, with something far beyond the authority he thought he held. Naomi turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting his one last time in that moment, and there was no anger there, no triumph, just clarity, the kind that does not need to explain itself. And as the weight of the scene settled fully around him, Brooks realized something he had not considered when he first stepped out of his car, something that came too late to change anything at all. This was never his situation to control. The air did not return to normal, not after those words, not after that quiet shift in control that no one announced but everyone felt, and Officer Brooks stood there with the identification still in his hand as if it had suddenly become heavier, like it carried a meaning he had completely missed. He looked at Naomi again, really looked this time, not through assumption, not through habit, but through something closer to realization, and what he saw was not the uncertainty he expected, not the hesitation he had counted on, but a calm that did not come from being right. It came from knowing she had never been in the wrong to begin with. "I was just doing my job," he said, the words coming out slower now, less certain, like he was trying to rebuild something that had already collapsed, but no one moved to respond, no one rushed to reassure him, because this moment was not about explanation, it was about consequence, quiet and controlled. The man beside Naomi extended a hand, and without a word she handed over the identification Brooks had been holding onto, the simple motion marking the end of something he had not realized was already over. "Thank you," the man said to her, his tone respectful, measured, as if the interruption had been the only inconvenience worth noting. Naomi gave a slight nod, her focus already shifting beyond the street, beyond the stop, towards something larger, something that had been waiting for her long before those flashing lights appeared behind her car. Brooks swallowed, his thoughts scrambling for ground, for justification, for anything that would return the situation to something familiar, but there was nothing left to hold on to. The vehicles idled quietly, their presence steady, their purpose clear without needing to be stated, and the street that had once belonged to his authority now felt like a place he was only standing in, not controlling. Naomi stepped forward, not rushed, not hesitant, simply moving with the same quiet precision she had carried from the beginning, and as she passed him, she paused just long enough for their eyes to meet again. There was no anger there, no accusation, just a clarity that made everything else unnecessary. "Next time," she said softly, her voice even, "make sure you know what you are stopping." It was not a threat. It was not a warning. It was a truth, simple and direct, and it landed deeper than anything louder ever could. Brooks did not respond, not because he did not want to, but because he finally understood that there was nothing left to say that would change what had already happened. Naomi continued forward, the men around her falling into step without needing instruction, and as she reached the waiting vehicles, one of the doors opened for her, the motion smooth, practiced, expected. She stepped inside without looking back, the door closing with a quiet finality that echoed louder than the sirens that had started it all. And as the engines rose again and the vehicles pulled away, disappearing into the night as quickly as they had arrived, Brooks remained where he was, the flashing lights from his patrol car still cutting through the darkness. But now they felt different, smaller somehow, like a signal that no longer meant what he thought it did. Because in a matter of minutes, without force, without resistance, everything he believed about control, about authority, about who belonged and who did not, had been rewritten in silence. The silence did not end when the vehicles disappeared, it lingered, stretching across the empty street. Like a question that had no easy answer, and Officer Brooks stood there longer than he needed to, longer than he realized, his hand still resting near his belt as if instinct alone could return him to something familiar, something certain, but nothing about this moment felt familiar anymore. The flashing lights from his patrol car continued to pulse behind him, casting red and blue shadows across the pavement, across his uniform, across a reality that had quietly shifted without asking for his permission. He exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cool night air, and for the first time, he was not scanning for threats, not searching for control, he was replaying what had just happened, piece by piece, word by word, expression by expression, and the more he tried to reconstruct it, the more it slipped beyond the simple narrative he had started with. She had not argued. She had not resisted. She had not even tried to prove herself. And somehow, that had changed everything. Brooks turned back toward his car, his steps slower now, less certain, as if each movement required more thought than it should, and when he reached the open door, he paused again, his reflection staring back at him in the window, distorted by the flicker of his own lights. For years, the badge had been enough. It had defined the situation before it even began. It had answered questions before they were asked. But tonight, for the first time, it had not been enough. The radio at his shoulder crackled softly, a routine check-in breaking through the quiet, but he did not respond right away, his mind still caught in that single sentence she had left behind. Make sure you know what you are stopping. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. But it stayed, repeating itself in a way that felt heavier each time. Brooks finally reached for the radio, his voice steady but lower than usual as he acknowledged the call, his tone carrying something new, something unfamiliar, something closer to restraint than confidence. He closed the car door, the sound sharper than it needed to be, and for a moment, he just stood there again, looking down the road where the vehicles had vanished, where the situation had ended without him. Somewhere in the distance, the city continued as it always did, unaware, unchanged, but for Brooks, something had shifted in a way that could not be undone. Because it was not just about one stop, one decision, one mistake. It was about the realization that control was never as absolute as it felt, that authority without understanding was fragile, and that sometimes, the person you question is the one holding the answers you were never prepared to hear. He stepped back into his car, the seat creaking softly beneath him, and as he turned off the flashing lights, the street returned to darkness, quiet and still, but the echo of what had happened remained, not in the air, not on the pavement, but in him. And as the engine started and he pulled away, there was no urgency in his movement, no rush to the next call, just a steady drive forward into a night that now felt different, not because the world had changed, but because he finally understood that he had misread it all along. The road stretched ahead in long, quiet lines as Brooks drove without urgency, the hum of his engine blending into the rhythm of a city that had already moved on from the moment that still held him back, and for the first time in years, he was not scanning every corner for violations, not anticipating the next stop, not preparing the next command. He was thinking, replaying, questioning. The dashboard lights cast a soft glow across his face, and in that reflection, something had shifted, something subtle but undeniable, like a crack that had always been there but had never been forced open until now. Imagine realizing that the certainty you carry for years was built on assumptions you never challenged. And now, in the quiet after everything, those assumptions begin to echo louder than any siren ever could. Brooks tightened his grip on the steering wheel slightly, not out of tension but out of focus, as if grounding himself in something real, something steady, because the memory of her calm refusal to react, her silence in the face of his authority, kept returning, not as defiance, but as control, a kind of control he did not understand until it was too late to matter. He passed familiar streets, familiar signs, places he had driven by countless times, but they felt different now, not because they had changed, but because he was seeing them without the filter he had always relied on. The radio crackled again, dispatch calling out a routine update, but this time, his response came slower, measured, his voice carrying less certainty and more awareness, like each word had to pass through thought before it was spoken. Somewhere between one block and the next, the question settled in deeper, not loud, not overwhelming, just persistent. What if he had been wrong before, not just tonight, but other times, moments he never questioned because the badge answered for him? The thought did not come with panic, it came with weight, the kind that does not disappear once noticed. Brooks slowed at a red light, the empty intersection stretching wide under the dim glow of overhead signals, and for a moment, everything stood still again, just like earlier. But this time, the silence was different, not tense, not uncertain, but reflective. He exhaled slowly, his eyes resting on the road ahead, and in that stillness, her words returned once more, not as a warning, not as a challenge, but as something far more lasting. Make sure you know what you are stopping. It was simple, almost obvious, and yet it carried a depth he had never considered, because knowing meant more than seeing, more than assuming, more than reacting. It meant understanding, and understanding required something he had not practiced enough. The light turned green, and Brooks moved forward, his speed steady, his posture composed, but his perspective no longer the same. The night continued around him, unchanged, but inside the car, inside his thoughts, something had shifted permanently. Because for the first time, authority did not feel like control, it felt like responsibility. And that difference, quiet as it was, would follow him long after this night was over. The city lights blurred softly past the windshield as Brooks continued driving, but his focus was no longer on the road ahead. It was on the weight of something new settling into his thoughts, something that refused to fade. No matter how many miles he put between himself and that quiet street. The routine that once guided him, the instinct that once felt automatic, now felt interrupted, like a pattern broken in a way that could not simply reset. Imagine going through years of decisions without question, only to realize that one moment can pull everything into focus, not with force, but with clarity. Brooks adjusted his grip on the wheel again, not out of tension, but habit, and even that felt different now, like he was aware of every small movement in a way he had never been before. The radio remained quiet for a while, an unusual calm that gave his thoughts more space than he wanted, more room for reflection than he was used to handling during a shift. He passed the parked car on the side of the road, its silhouette barely visible under a dim streetlight, and for a split second, his instincts flared, the old pattern ready to activate, ready to question, ready to assume, but he slowed instead, just slightly, his eyes taking in more than just the outline, more than just the surface. And then he kept driving. That small decision, almost invisible to anyone else, felt heavier than it should have, not because of what he did, but because of what he did not do. The absence of action carried its own meaning now. The memory of Naomi's composure returned again, not as a confrontation, but as a contrast, a quiet standard he had not realized he was being measured against. She had not needed to prove anything. She had not needed to explain. And yet, everything about her had spoken louder than any argument he could have made. Brooks exhaled slowly, his shoulders easing just slightly as the tension shifted into something more reflective, more controlled, like he was learning to pause in ways he never had before. The road curved gently ahead, leading him into another stretch of the city, familiar but no longer predictable in the same way. Another call came through the radio, a simple welfare check just a few blocks away. Nothing urgent, nothing unusual, the kind of situation he would normally approach without a second thought. "Copy that," he responded, his voice steady, but there was something different in it now, something more deliberate. As he approached the address, he slowed earlier than necessary, his eyes scanning not just for issues, but for context, for understanding, for details that might have gone unnoticed before. A porch light flickered at the end of a driveway. A figure standing near the door, waiting, not threatening, not hiding, just present. Brooks parked his car without the sudden urgency he once carried, turning off the flashing lights before stepping out, letting the scene remain calm, undisturbed. The air felt different this time, not because the situation had changed, but because he had. And as he walked forward, each step measured, each movement intentional, it became clear that the moment from earlier had not ended on that street. It had followed him, shaping the way he saw, the way he acted, the way he understood what it meant to hold authority. Because sometimes the most powerful shift does not come from what happens to you, but from what you choose to see after it is over, and for Brooks, that shift had already begun. The porch light flickered once more as Brooks approached, its soft glow casting long shadows across the driveway, and the figure standing by the door shifted slightly, not in fear, not in urgency, but in quiet anticipation, like someone waiting to be heard rather than questioned. Brooks slowed his steps just a fraction before reaching the edge of the walkway, his presence no longer announced by authority alone but by something more measured, more aware. "Evening," he said, his voice steady, controlled, but different now, carrying less weight of command and more of acknowledgement. The man by the door nodded, his posture relaxed but attentive, his eyes meeting Brooks without hesitation. "I called earlier," he said calmly, gesturing toward the house behind him. "Just wanted someone to check on my neighbor. Lights have been off all day, and she usually keeps them on." Brooks glanced past him, taking in the quiet house next door, the stillness of the windows, the absence of movement, and for a moment, he simply observed, letting the scene speak before stepping into it. Imagine pausing long enough to understand, before deciding what something means. That pause, brief as it was, changed everything. "All right," Brooks replied, his tone even. "Let us take a look." He walked toward the neighboring house, his steps deliberate, his eyes scanning not just for signs of trouble but for signs of context, of life, of something that might explain the silence without immediately labeling it as something else. The front yard was undisturbed, the mailbox closed, a small wind chime swaying gently in the night breeze, its soft sound the only movement breaking the stillness. Brooks reached the door and knocked, not forcefully, not urgently, but clearly enough to be heard if someone was inside. He waited. No response. He knocked again, this time calling out, his voice calm. "Police department, just checking in." The seconds stretched, quiet but not tense, and Brooks resisted the urge to jump to conclusions, resisted the instinct that once would have pushed him forward faster, louder, more certain. Instead, he stepped back slightly, giving the moment space, giving the situation time to reveal itself. Behind him, the neighbor watched quietly, trusting the process without needing to question it. And then, faintly, there was movement inside, slow, careful, followed by the soft sound of a lock turning. The door opened just a few inches, revealing an elderly woman, her expression tired but aware, her eyes adjusting to the light outside. "Yes?" she asked gently, her voice soft but steady. Brooks offered a small nod, his posture easing. "Just making sure you are all right, ma'am. Your neighbor was concerned." The woman glanced past him, offering a faint smile toward the man by the driveway. "That is kind of him," she said, opening the door a little wider now, the warm light from inside spilling onto the porch. "I have not been feeling well today, just resting." Brooks nodded again, taking in the explanation without suspicion, without resistance, just understanding. "Glad to hear you are okay," he replied, his tone genuine. And in that moment, there was no tension, no escalation, no misunderstanding, just a simple interaction resolved by patience instead of assumption. As Brooks stepped back, giving her space, something settled quietly in his mind, not as a lesson forced upon him, but as a realization he had arrived at on his own. Because sometimes, the difference between control and clarity is not what you do, but how long you are willing to wait before doing it, and tonight, for the first time, Brooks had waited. Brooks stepped away from the porch slowly, the soft creak of the wooden boards fading behind him as the door gently closed, and the warm light from inside disappeared, leaving the street once again wrapped in quiet darkness. But this time, the silence did not feel heavy or uncertain, it felt settled, like something had been understood without needing to be explained. The neighbor gave him a small nod of appreciation from the driveway, his shoulders relaxed now, the concern that had brought him outside replaced with quiet relief. "Thank you, officer," he said simply, his voice carrying genuine gratitude, not tension, not fear. Brooks nodded back, a subtle acknowledgement, but even that felt different now, less like a routine exchange and more like a shared understanding, a moment where authority had not been used to control, but to listen. Imagine realizing that the smallest decisions, the ones no one notices, are the ones that shape everything. Brooks walked back toward his patrol car, his steps steady, his posture composed, but inside, there was a shift that continued to unfold, quiet but persistent. He reached the driver's side door and paused for just a moment, his hand resting against the frame as his eyes scanned the street one more time, not searching for problems, but observing, taking in the details that had always been there but rarely noticed. A porch light down the block flickered softly, a car passed slowly at the end of the street, its headlights sweeping across the pavement, and for a moment, everything felt connected in a way he had never considered before. He opened the door and slid into the seat, the familiar interior surrounding him, but the familiarity did not bring the same certainty it once did. Instead, it felt like a space where new thoughts had room to form, where old patterns no longer filled every corner. The radio remained quiet, and Brooks did not rush to break that silence. He started the engine, the low hum grounding him in the present, and as he pulled away from the curb, his movements were smooth, deliberate, not driven by urgency but by awareness. The streets ahead stretched out, familiar routes he had taken countless times, but now each turn carried a different weight, a different intention. He slowed at an intersection, even though there was no traffic, no immediate reason to hesitate, but something in him chose patience over speed, understanding over assumption. And as he waited, even for that brief moment, the memory returned again, not as a confrontation, but as a quiet mirror reflecting everything he had begun to see differently. Naomi's calm, her silence, her certainty, it had not just ended that stop, it had started something else, something he could not ignore. Because for the first time, Brooks understood that authority was not about being right in the moment, it was about being willing to question that moment before acting on it. The light changed, and he moved forward, the car gliding through the intersection with steady ease, and as the night continued around him, nothing appeared different on the surface. But beneath it, within him, something had already begun to change in a way that would not simply fade with time. Because once you see clearly, even just once, it becomes impossible to go back to seeing the way you did before. The patrol car moved steadily through the quiet grid of streets, each block blending into the next, but inside the vehicle, nothing felt routine anymore, not the way it used to, not the way it had just hours ago, and Brooks found himself noticing things he would have once ignored, small details that carried meaning only when you chose to see them. The flicker of a streetlight above an empty sidewalk, the slow movement of a pedestrian crossing without urgency, the way a parked car sat undisturbed under a tree, none of it demanded action, none of it required authority, but all of it required awareness, and for the first time, that difference mattered. Imagine realizing that not every moment needs to be controlled, that sometimes the strongest move is to understand before you act. Brooks adjusted the rearview mirror slightly, his eyes catching his own reflection for just a second, and there was something different there, something quieter, more grounded, like the certainty he once carried had been replaced with something more deliberate. The radio broke the silence again, dispatch calling in a routine traffic assist a few blocks ahead, nothing urgent, just a stalled vehicle causing a minor delay, the kind of situation he would normally approach quickly, efficiently, without hesitation. "On my way," he responded, his voice calm, steady, but measured, as if each word had weight behind it now. He turned onto the next street, the scene coming into view slowly. A sedan pulled over to the side, hazard lights blinking in a steady rhythm, casting soft orange pulses across the pavement. A woman stood near the car, her posture tense but composed, her arms folded as she looked down the road, waiting. Brooks slowed his approach, not rushing in, not assuming, just observing. He parked a few yards behind the vehicle, turning off the siren but leaving the soft glow of his lights for visibility, and as he stepped out, his movements were calm, controlled, intentional. "Everything all right here?" he asked as he approached, his tone neutral, open, leaving space for the answer rather than forcing it. The woman turned, a brief flicker of relief crossing her face. "Car just died on me," she said, her voice steady but tired. "I called for a tow, but it is taking longer than expected." Brooks nodded, taking in the situation without jumping ahead, without adding assumptions that did not belong. He glanced at the vehicle, then back at her, and instead of questioning further, instead of pressing, he simply said, "Let us make sure you are safe while you wait." It was a small shift, a simple sentence, but it changed the interaction entirely. There was no tension, no imbalance, just a moment of support where authority existed without pressure. The woman relaxed slightly, her shoulders lowering as the situation settled into something manageable, something understood. Brooks stepped back, giving her space, his presence. Steady but not imposing, and as the hazard lights continued their quiet rhythm, he found himself standing there not as someone enforcing control, but as someone ensuring calm. And in that moment, it became clear that what had started earlier that night had not ended with a single encounter, it had carried forward, shaping each decision, each interaction, each pause, into something more aware, something more human. Because sometimes, the true measure of authority is not how much you control, but how much you choose not to. The hazard lights continued their steady pulse, casting soft reflections across the quiet road as Brooks stood a few steps back from the stranded car, his presence calm, grounded, no longer driven by urgency but by intention, and the woman leaned lightly against her vehicle now, her posture more relaxed, her breathing even, as if the simple act of being heard had shifted something in her as well. Time moved differently in moments like this, slower, more deliberate, and Brooks found himself not rushing to fill the silence, not searching for the next action, but allowing the situation to exist as it was, uncomplicated, understood. Imagine realizing that not every interaction needs to be controlled to be effective, that sometimes presence alone carries more weight than authority ever could. A distant set of headlights appeared down the road, growing gradually brighter as a tow truck approached, its engine low and steady, and the woman straightened slightly, a small sense of relief crossing her face as the situation moved toward resolution. "That should be them," she said, her voice lighter now, no longer carrying the tension it had when Brooks first arrived. He nodded, watching as the truck pulled up smoothly behind the car, the driver stepping out with practiced ease, offering a quick greeting before moving to assess the situation. Brooks remained where he was, not stepping in unnecessarily, not taking over, just observing, ensuring that everything stayed calm, that everything moved as it should. The process was simple, efficient, and within minutes, the car was being prepared to be towed, the woman gathering her belongings with a quiet sense of closure. She turned back toward Brooks, offering a small but genuine smile. "Thank you for staying," she said, her voice sincere, and it was not about what he had done, it was about how he had done it, the difference that could not be measured in actions alone. Brooks gave a slight nod in return, his response simple. "Glad you are taken care of." But even those words carried something more now, something intentional, something that reflected the shift that had been building since earlier that night. The tow truck pulled away slowly, the woman seated safely inside, and the street returned to its quiet rhythm once again, the moment resolved without complication, without escalation, without misunderstanding. Brooks walked back toward his patrol car, his steps steady, his thoughts clear, and as he reached the door, he paused briefly, his hand resting against the frame as he looked down the now empty road. There was no tension left, no urgency, just a quiet sense of completion, and in that stillness, something settled deeper within him, not as a realization forced by circumstance, but as a change that had been earned through awareness. Because the difference between control and clarity had revealed itself not through confrontation, but through contrast, through moments that showed what happens when you choose to see instead of assume. Brooks stepped into the car, the familiar seat no longer feeling like a place of automatic response, but a space of deliberate action, and as he started the engine once more, the road ahead did not feel like a series of tasks to complete, but a series of choices to make. Each stop, each interaction, each moment carried the potential to repeat the past or to reshape it, and for the first time, that choice felt real, felt present, felt entirely his to make. And as the car moved forward into the night, the quiet lesson of everything that had come before did not fade behind him, it moved with him, steady and persistent, shaping not just what he would do next, but how he would choose to do it. The engine hummed steadily beneath Brooks as the patrol car moved through the late hours of the night, the city now quieter, softer, like it had settled into a rhythm that no longer demanded control but invited awareness, and for the first time in a long time, he was not waiting for something to happen, he was present in what was already there. The streets were nearly empty now, storefronts dark, traffic lights cycling through colors with no one to command, and in that quiet, something became clear, not all at once, but in layers, like a truth that had been waiting for him to slow down enough to finally hear it. Imagine realizing that the power you thought defined you was never the most important thing you carried, that what mattered more was how you chose to use it when no one was watching. Brooks eased the car to a slower pace as he passed a familiar intersection, one he had crossed hundreds of times without thinking, but tonight, he noticed the details, the way the light reflected off the empty asphalt, the stillness of the buildings, the absence of urgency, and it felt different, not because the world had changed, but because he had stopped rushing through it. His hands rested lightly on the wheel now, no tension, no automatic readiness, just control in the simplest sense, and his thoughts returned one last time to that moment earlier, not with regret, not with defensiveness, but with understanding. Naomi had not needed to prove anything. She had not needed to raise her voice. She had simply allowed the truth to reveal itself, and in doing so, she had shown him something no training ever had. Authority is not proven in how quickly you act, but in how carefully you choose to. The radio remained quiet, almost respectfully so, as if even the routine noise of the job had stepped back to give space to something more important, and Brooks found himself driving without expectation, without the constant anticipation of the next call, just moving forward with intention. A green light turned yellow ahead, and he slowed naturally, not pushing through, not forcing the moment, just letting it pass as it should, and when the light turned red he stopped, not because he had to, but because he chose to. That difference, small as it seemed, carried more meaning than any command he had given that night. He looked out. Across the intersection, the empty road stretching in all directions, and for a brief moment, everything felt still again, not tense, not uncertain, just open. And in that openness, the lesson settled fully, not as a correction, but as a transformation. Because the badge did not make the moment right. The choice did. The light turned green, and Brooks moved forward, the car gliding smoothly into the next stretch of road, and as the night continued around him, nothing about the city had changed, but everything about the way he moved through it had. Because sometimes, the real shift does not come from being stopped, it comes from finally understanding what should never have been assumed in the first place, and once that understanding takes hold, it does not leave, it does not fade, it stays, guiding every step, every decision, every moment that follows. The night stretched on, quiet and steady, as Brooks continued down the open road, the city now reduced to soft lights and distant movement, and for the first time, there was no urgency chasing him, no expectation pressing him forward, just a calm understanding that settled deeper with every passing mile. The patrol car moved smoothly beneath him, the hum of the engine no longer just background noise but a steady reminder that motion did not always require force, that progress did not always come from pushing harder. Imagine carrying something unseen, something that changes the way you look at every moment without anyone else noticing, without any announcement, just a quiet shift that stays with you long after the moment that caused it is gone. Brooks glanced briefly at the rearview mirror, not out of habit this time, but out of reflection, and what he saw was not just a uniform, not just a badge, but a person who had finally paused long enough to question what those things meant beyond authority. The road ahead remained open, familiar, but no longer predictable in the way it once was, because now every intersection, every stop, every interaction carried a choice, not automatic, not assumed, but intentional. The memory of that earlier moment no longer felt sharp or overwhelming, it felt settled, like a foundation that had been rebuilt from something more solid than assumption. Naomi had not raised her voice, had not demanded recognition, had not forced anything to change, and yet everything had changed. Not around her, but within him. That was the difference. Brooks slowed slightly as he approached another intersection, the traffic light glowing red against the dark sky, and he stopped without hesitation, his hands resting lightly on the wheel, his posture relaxed but aware. There was no one else around, no cars approaching, no reason to wait other than the signal itself, and still, he remained there, not because he had to, but because he understood the value of the pause. The light eventually turned green, and he moved forward, steady, composed, and as the car carried him deeper into the night, the silence around him no longer felt empty, it felt full of something unspoken, something that did not need to be explained to exist. Because sometimes the most important changes are the ones no one sees, the ones that do not come with recognition or reward, but with understanding. And as Brooks continued on, one thought remained, clear and unwavering, not as a question, but as a truth he would carry forward into every moment that followed. He thought the badge gave him control. But that night, control showed him what it really meant to understand.